Hi, today I want to talk about the Pareto principle, or the 80-20 principle, and how it applies to language learning. We often hear it said that a small number of words, 500, 1,000, account for 70, 80% of the vocabulary in any given context. And therefore, people suggest that if we focus in on these high-frequency words, that we will be able to short-circuit our language learning. So that's what I'm going to get into. But first, let's look at the Pareto principle, where it came from. So Pareto, Vilfredo Pareto, was a professor of economics at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland back in the early 1900s, and he discovered that in Italy, 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. He then noticed that the same was true in other countries. And of course, inequality of wealth, inequality of incomes is a factor of life today. And I'll show you these two maps, one for income distribution, which is a little different from the maps of wealth distribution. But in all countries, when it comes to wealth, 20% of the population controls between 60 to 80 or more percent of the wealth in that country. So that still is the case today. However, the Pareto principle and this 80-20 rule has become more important, or more people pay attention to it today, as a means to address problems in production and quality control. And that's because of a Professor Duran, immigrant from Romania, who in the United States started using this 80-20 principle to address engineering issues and quality control issues. And he talked about the most useful 20%, but then also accepted the fact that the remaining 80% were still important, or at least helpful. And that, again, has application to language learning in terms of how we deal with high-frequency words and the very important low-frequency words. But insofar as the 80-20 principle, we've seen it applied in so many different situations. A small percentage of criminals commit most of the crime. A small percentage of the population are occupying most of the hospital beds. In computing, it was said that if you can fix the 20% most serious bugs in a piece of software, you'll have dealt with most of the problems. Conversely, it's said that 80% of the code can be written in 20% of the time. But the corollary to that is you spend 80% of your time trying to finalize that 20% of the code that has to be written. And so this again has application for language learning, where we will end up spending most of our time dealing with low frequency words, even though the high frequency words account for the bulk of the content of any particular context. Let's move on then to how I use the 80-20 rule in my own language learning. And I'm going to refer to my Turkish, but I think it applies to all languages. So first of all, let's deal with this idea of vocabulary. So the most frequent 500 words, 1,000 words account for 70, 80% of any given context. What can we draw from that? Well, what I draw from that is I needn't make any special effort to focus in on those high frequency words, because they're going to show up anyway. I know that down the road, I'm going to have to focus and spend a lot of time on learning the less frequent words. The high frequency words, I needn't worry about. They're going to show up and I'm going to gradually get used to them anyway. To some extent, the same is true with structures in the language. You could Google and look at, the application of Pareto principle or 80-20 rule to language learning. You can Google, the most frequent errors or difficulties that people have in Spanish, English, Chinese. And you can say, okay, I'm going to look at examples of other people who focus in on the main problems that they experience with the language. But here again, my experience is basically in the Slavic languages, I know it's cases, it's aspects of verbs of motion that cause me difficulty. In Turkish, it's the verbs. There's so many different forms of the verbs. I think verbs are usually there as a major area of difficulty. But prepositions, case endings, pronouns, there's any number of different things that can cause the bulk of the problems that we encounter in grammar. But again, my experience has been that I will eventually come across those in all kinds of different contexts and gradually get used to them, so that focusing in on them specifically may be of limited benefit. However, how I use the 80-20 rule in my language learning is to tell myself, how am I going to spend my time? I have spoken before of what I would call big picture learning, input learning, consuming a lot of the language, top-down learning. And then there is this bits and pieces, focusing in on, it might be the case endings in Slavic languages, it might be verb endings in Romance languages, or pronouns in Italian, or whatever it might be. It's not that I don't do that. I do some of that. I do look up grammar explanations online or in a book. I have my lessons with my tutor. So I do spend time on the nuts and bolts. But 80% of my time is spent absorbing the language and acquiring words. And the reason for that is that if I have a lot of words, then I can access more interesting content. I can actually understand some of the examples of structures in the language, so that as I go forward in the language, what's holding me back is lack of words. And the words, which includes a lot of low frequency words, they are acquired through the 80% big picture, top-down, input-based learning. So it's not that I don't do any sort of bits and pieces learning. I do some, but I try to limit the amount of time I spend on that. For example, with my Turkish learning. So I started back in 2018. You can see from this graph that in an initial period, I spent a lot of time listening. You can see my statistics from my playlist that I've listened to the mini stories. In fact, initially I spent most of my time with the mini stories to get a sense of the language, to get some words in me, to get a toehold in the language, listening 30, 40 times to the same mini story, not at the same time, but eventually, because I go back to them and I go back to them. And so that was, in a way, big picture learning, because the language was new to me. So I was just kind of, bombarding my brain with the language, occasionally looking at explanations. Of course, I bought grammar books, but that was 5 years ago. Now, when I started up again in preparation for my trip to Turkey, I'm saying I've got to dramatically increase my vocabulary, because I want to be dealing with things of interest. And so that my major emphasis for the last little while has been on increasing my vocabulary. And yet when I talk to my tutor, I realize how much difficulty I have in some of the most basic patterns in the language, how much difficulty I have in producing, verb forms correctly. So, as I'm now a month away from going to Turkey, I've decided to spend a little more time on the bits and pieces. And I do that by going back into my mini stories, where there's a lot of focus on verbs, high frequency verbs. And so when I go to them now again, I'm discovering things and noticing things that I didn't notice before. Because after a while, if we're listening to the same thing over and over again, we are noticing less and less. So after an absence, then I go back. Another thing to remember is, even if back 5 years ago, I thought I had learned something, or thought I could remember a verb or a word or a verb form, chances are I can't remember it now. So we have to be aware of the fact that whatever we do, it's a little bit elusive. We won't necessarily be able to grab it and hold on to it. And so therefore, I think it's very important, and I always make sure that I mix the big picture with the bits and pieces. So even now, when I say I'm going to spend more time with my mini stories, it's still a small amount of time, because by the time I'm on my third mini story, my brain isn't paying much attention. So when I switch back to my history of the Turks, or the novel Havanın Üç Kızı, even though I don't understand it all that well, I'm more motivated. I'm hanging on to the words, and then I can go through them in link. Another thing that's useful, I find, again, varying that big picture with the bits and pieces, is to do, the sentence review, where I have to reassemble the sentence. That's particularly good with the mini stories, because the mini stories sentences are short. I have heard them many times, and then I can start to put those sentences together. It's a form of being focused in on how the language works, how the verbs work, how the genitive works, all these things that I have trouble with. So I try to maintain a good balance between big picture learning and bits and pieces learning. And perhaps beyond the idea that I want to maintain a balance of 80-20, 90-10, whatever it might be, between big picture and bits and pieces learning, at the same time, I ask myself, am I enjoying it? When we start out in a language, we have a high tolerance for relatively repetitive, uninteresting content like the mini stories. There's a sense of achievement as we understand a little bit more and a little bit more. We often think we've learned something that we can maybe now use, and we discover we can't use it because it's somehow back there in the brain somewhere. You can't bring it out when you need it. But am I enjoying it? And when I stop enjoying it, then I move on to more difficult content. And there again, going through in-sentence mode, but learning about the Turks, about Central Asia, about the Balkans, about Anatolia, about whatever it might be. Or, as in the case of this three daughters of Eve, learning about some of the social and almost psychological issues of modern day Turks. So that's interesting. So my guide is, am I enjoying what I'm doing? And if I'm enjoying what I'm doing, then I keep doing it. When I now find it sort of too frustrating to continue in content that has so many unknown words, and that I would be happier or feel more comfortable being in easier content, then I move back to easier content. But by and large, I think I try to maintain at least 80% of my time with big picture, top-down learning, but not neglect the 20%, 10, 15% of time that I need to spend on focusing in on the bits and pieces. So I hope that was helpful. I've left some links here on this subject to a Wikipedia article on the subject, and I'm curious how all of you use the 80-20 principle in your language learning. Bye for now.